Hey Sandesh, how are you?
Oh, hey, good. Just got the notification from the computer lady
What
about
computer?
you just said recording in progress, but in a very stern,
Oh,
stern fashion.
yeah, computer voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see. Let's jump in, I guess. Or is there anything to talk about first?
You mean about the articles or just in general?
Well, in general.
Uh, well, yeah, I had my first rehearsal with Melia yesterday for her show,
Oh,
and that
okay.
went. And then I'm gonna have another rehearsal next week, and yeah, and I guess I was able to get both the percussionists for MME. Um,
That's good.
I mean, initially they just said they can only afford one percussionist, but
You can only afford one. I don't think they're paying them, are they? Maybe
no,
they are. I don't know.
no. I meant afford just in terms of like labor. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, they both, I guess, both Melissa and Rose are excited to play on the piece. So
Good. All right. Why don't we jump into reading? It's a ton of stuff, I think if you want to work towards reading some Kristeva, the things to take from Schopenhauer, there are really two big things to take from Schopenhauer. One is from the his dissertation, The Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason. The relationship between consciousness, knowledge, and individuation, and the sort of metaphysical unity that he posits being the will,
yeah,
right? Um, because both Lacan and Kristeva have some kind of relationship in their some kind of structure that's related to that, although they all have different ideas about what actually is the real state of affairs in the world. So, Schopenhauer really does think that individuation is an illusion, and the world understood as will is some sort of unity.
right.
And Lacan basically flips that around and says, no, actually, reality is all sort of this fleeting. It's interesting because with Schopenhauer, he does say that the world of the will is unity, but it's a self-contradictory unity, or it's a unity that's in tension with itself.
Right.
And Lacan basically says half of that is right.
Uh-huh.
The world outside of our consciousness or outside of language is in conflict. It's just not a unity. And
Oh,
the unity is only something that becomes apparent through language, but
mm,
the unity itself is an illusion. Not that individuality is an illusion and unity is real, but unity is an illusion. And, individuality, or, this sort of conflict um, is real. It's just that that conflict isn't unified.
I see.
And then Kristeva has a take on it that's complicated because she basically does follow Lacan in saying that unity is it's hard to say whether or not it's exactly an illusion. Maybe that's not quite the right way to say it, because both Lacan and Kristeva basically have this idea that we feel like we have lost some sort of unity, like we feel as though there's some sort of unity that we can just barely touch or grasp, but we can't actually conceptualize or something like that.
I see.
And what Lacan says is that the structure of language is such that it unifies consciousness,
Mm.
because consciousness and the subconscious, according to Lacan, is structured like a language. Um, I would say for Lacan, it really is the case that the unity is an illusion. But for Kristeva, it's more like this: the unity isn't exactly an illusion. It's
Mm.
just that the only way that we can become conscious of it is to already have lost it.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Okay.
and the reason for that is that if you're in the unity already, right? If you're just pure, you think about it as the relationship between being in the flow of experience and thinking about your experience, right? If you're in the flow of experience, if you're unified with your experience or whatever, you can't actually think about the experience. And in some sense, if you're as unified as possible, you're not even conscious of your experience.
Yeah.
It's only in stepping outside of your experience that you can then think about it or become conscious of it, but then you're outside of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so if you are unified, then you can't be aware that you're unified.
Yeah.
It's only in developing language, developing identity, and coming to a point where you can see yourself as separate from that underlying unity that you realize that you've lost it.
Yeah.
Right. But it's this sort of impossible desire for something you can't return to, because to return to it actually, well, for one thing, you can't get outside of language once you've developed language, but also it's this sort of thing where you can't exactly return to it, because if you do return to it, you also lose it because you're no longer conscious of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of Kristeva's picture of the relationship between the unity paradigm and the individuality paradigm. And the readings from Lacan and Kristeva that I think are probably actually their most famous readings and probably the most useful, specifically ask that question: how do human subjects become individuals?
Right.
Right. And so that's where it syncs up with Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer has this pretty elaborate theory of how that works out. Like, what is the relationship between unity, the sort of conflict of the world, and individuality? And in the case of Schopenhauer, he doesn't really talk about language that much, but he talks about it in terms of knowledge and consciousness. And Lacan basically takes the same sort of approach, except instead of referring to it in terms of consciousness, he's talking about it in terms of structural linguistics.
Mm.
And Kristeva also follows Lacan in having a linguistic account, but then she's also, well, I suppose Lacan actually does use a lot of material from Freud as
Mm.
well. So both in Lacan and Kristeva, there's an extra element, which is psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
Um,
So would Lacan say like the unity is like when the child is in the womb?
well, yeah, I mean that's basically right.
Mm.
Um, although not quite actually. Kristeva would say something like that. What Lacan would say is something like, well, you're not conscious when you're in the womb. You have some consciousness once you're born, and for the first 18 months of life, you haven't developed language yet. And so you actually, infants don't really, um, they're not exactly conscious of their world in the way that we're conscious of our world once we develop categories and words and concepts for our world, right? And what Lacan thinks is that there's actually a sort of, I don't know, something terrifying and exhilarating for the infants in this world where nothing really makes sense and everything is just, like pure bodily experience.
Mm-hmm.
And at around 18 months, the child starts to develop language, and usually children are in relationships with their parents, where the parents congratulate them for, discovering their individuality or their personality or that sort of thing. So, this and certainly parents encourage their children to start speaking, and so it's not just that, biologically or maybe logically categories start to form and that sort of thing, but there's also this emotional register of it wherein the parents are actively encouraging that and valuing it as good. Right.
Mm-hmm.
The unity means good. Unity means I get love, basically, right?
Yeah.
When I start talking, or when so his thought experiment is about a child looking in the mirror and discovering that it's not just a bunch of, separate, limbs and body parts and whatever, but realizing that it is a unified being, and that's usually connected with praise from the parents and that sort of thing, right? But he thinks that there's also something kind of tragic about that, because it's a moment where the unity that you experience in that is all just an illusion. And so he thinks that moment of experiencing a unity that isn't real is one of the things that gives rise to desire. It's this sort of, really what it is that it's the structure of language is such that it leads us to categorize things, to put them into groups. In other words, groups are basically a way of saying that they're unified under some description or something like that. But it's the structure of language that makes us feel that the world can be unified, but that's actually an illusion. And so the structure of desire is always a move towards unity, but that unity doesn't really exist. It's just like an artifact of language. And so that's part of what's tragic about desire, that it's always desire directed at an object, but the object isn't actually, it's unity with an object. So here's a really straightforward way of describing why it is that he thinks that desire, the structure of desire, involves an awareness of separation and a move towards unity, the desire or the motivation to attain unity. If you think about it in terms of our basic biological desires, like hunger. Okay, so hunger is, how can you describe the structure of hunger? Well, you're an organism, and on some sort of physical level, you experience some kind of disequilibrium. There's maybe it's chemical reactions or whatever. There's an enzyme called ghrelin. I know because I've been like doing the intermittent fasting and stuff.
Oh, okay.
But so there's this enzyme ghrelin that when you don't eat for a while, the world feels like it's about to fall apart. I mean, it's just this awful feeling, but it's not like you rationally analyze the world and think, okay, something's wrong, something, doesn't follow from a premise or whatever. No, it's like you just feel like something is imbalanced.
Yeah.
You feel the imbalance immediately. What's the solution to that? Well, in addition to the internal imbalance, you might also feel that you're sort of in a state of imbalance with your environment as well. For one thing, if you're starving to death, you are unable to manipulate your environment. You're sort of, for one thing, you just feel really tired and whatever, right? So what's the solution? You take part of your environment and you make it part of you, right? In other words, you take something from the world and you eat it and it becomes part of you, right? And that's basically the structure. On the example of hunger, that's basically the structure, that there's this awareness of an imbalance, there's this awareness of a lack of unity, maybe with the environment or whatever. And what you do is you try to unify the environment with yourself. Right. And so, the other paradigm example that people talk about very often is like lust or love or whatever, right? This idea of love being also a desire for unity. And with Freud in the, I hope it's clear, like, the idea of unity and love, not only unity with another person on both a physical and sort of emotional level, but then also, a lot of these guys were pretty, well, I don't know. They're not exactly heteronormative, because Freud has all sorts of thoughts about the origin of sexuality and that kind of thing. He actually thinks that most children are, polymorphous perverse. Have you heard that phrase before. He thinks that heterosexuality arises pretty late, and it's something that is shaped by the superego, in other words, culture and whatever. But in any case, nonetheless, there's this idea that one expression of the desire that we call love is the just the biological drive to reproduce, right? And the biological drive to reproduce can be understood in terms of separate individuals unifying into the production of a new individual or something like that, right? So anyway, the point is just that desire is often thought in this tradition as involving the awareness of some kind of lack or the awareness of a separation and a move towards unity. Mm-hmm. The idea that the move towards unity is also the fulfillment of a lack.
Right.
Okay.
Talk about like different I guess types of desire, like example, just like thinking of like something like hunger. It just seems like it's sort of, there's like no like free will in a way like involved in it, because like your body just like reacts in certain.
Yeah.
And I don't know, like to use a term from like the one of the articles, like maybe there's some desires that are like contemplation resistant, and then there are some where it's a little more complicated and there's more contemplation involved. So for example, like hunger and like maybe like lust and stuff is like contemplation resistant because it's just like something that your body desires and it just kind of comes out and you have little control over it, as opposed to something where you want to, I don't know, take like throw the current president.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's interesting. The vocabulary in psychoanalysis would be that those contemplation conducive desires are sublimations. In other words, they are higher order versions, more sophisticated or more complex expressions of underlying contemplation resistant. It's sort of odd. What literature are you referring to, where you say where you're getting those terms?
Yeah, this was the one on aesthetics, the article
from SEP, from Stanford Encyclopedia. Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, that's not a term that Schopenhauer uses himself. But I think it's a useful way of thinking, and maybe it's a little bit less mystical sounding than sublimation, which is a Freudian term, But in psychoanalytic speak, what you're describing is this idea that all of the desires that we might have, including things like religious desires or these very high level sorts of desires that seem maybe even quite abstract, are all in the final analysis reducible to underlying biological drives. Right. So it's a pretty physicalist account generally. I mean, Freud, for all the for his reputation of being sort of I don't know, kind of a mystical thinker or whatever. That's sort of the way popular culture thinks about him. He really saw himself as someone who's committed to a physical analysis of the world, a scientific analysis of the world. And really he saw himself as a scientist. And I would say that the only thing about his work that would lead people to believe that he wasn't just your standard sort of scientific thinker is that his theories are typically underdetermined by the evidence. In other words, the evidence that he draws his theories from, or that he develops his theories to account for, could actually be accounted for by a wide variety of other theories. And there isn't anything unique about the data that shows that it's necessarily explainable and only explainable by a psychoanalytic theory, right? So, and part of the problem is just that most of the important elements of psychoanalytic theory aren't actually testable. You can't really run experiments to test the sorts of things that he argues for instance, the idea that dreams are a form of wish fulfillment. What sort of experiment are you going to run exactly? I mean, you could try to do some sort of psychological experiment, but even there, it's really tricky with dreams. We don't have access to dreams as some sort of observational phenomenon, and so the best you can do is ask people to talk about their dreams, but generally, how much can you rely on people to remember their dreams accurately? And it's really problematic from the point of view of empirical testing. And so now that's not to say that it's in principle just wrong. It's just that the sorts of phenomena that he's interested in aren't amenable to scientific testing. So, but that doesn't mean that he was a mystical thinker, right? It's just that, he's trying to account for phenomena that are, for one thing, irreducibly subjective and personal and unique. Right? So, and those are different problems, right? I mean, the fact that, say, consciousness is subjective, right? Consciousness is the way that it's often described in the philosophy of mind is that its ontology is subjective. In other words, once you try to reduce consciousness to physical processes, you lose the necessary condition of consciousness, which is that it has this subjective, first personal, phenomenal content, right? Basically, it's like saying this, you could show, let's say that our science is developed enough to show that all thought processes are reducible to events in the brain that you can measure and diagram and whatever, and show in an MRI or whatever future technology we have. Problem still is that those brain processes themselves aren't conscious.
Right.
Because what you're trying to do is describe something that in its ontology is subjective. In other words, it's so a really important distinction. This might actually pop up when we talk about Schopenhauer too, is the distinction between something being epistemically subjective or objective versus ontologically subjective or objective. Something is subjectively if something is epistemically subjective, it means that it's known from, say, a first personal point of view. Whereas if it's objective, it can be known from a third personal point of view. So it's something like this. Right now, let's see, let me give you a good example. Okay. I don't know. I'm trying to do it and not just give you a really general example, but like, okay, right now, there's an objective fact of the matter about what you have in your pockets. I don't know that. I don't know what you have in your pockets. So epistemically, if I say, it's not epistemically, or I'm sorry, it's not ontologically subjective what is in your pockets. In other words, there really is something in your pockets, but epistemically, I don't know what it is. I could know if I actually go and look, and I would say that my knowledge is objective. I know what the objective facts are, but as it is now, my knowledge is subjective. I don't know what they are, right? And so it's from my point of view, I can't say exactly what is in your pockets, right? Okay, something like that. Okay. But the fact that I don't know from my point of view doesn't mean that there isn't an objective fact of the matter.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And that's just because my knowledge is subjective, but there's an ontology that's objective. There really is something in your pockets. right? It's just that it's not something that I have access to right now.
Right.
Okay, does that make sense? I mean, that's a really straightforward.
Yeah.
You talk about something really existing in the world, whether or not somebody knows about it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, its ontology is objective.
Yeah.
Our knowledge is generally subjective, but we could, if we can demonstrate that the thing really exists, then we could say, well, our knowledge is now objective because our knowledge accords with what, the fact of the matter is. Okay, is that clear?
So, yeah. So in order to make that epistemic statement, you need another subject, and you know that this subject has an inner subjective experience, like an ontological.
Well, no, not necessarily. I guess no other person really has to exist in this particular example. I mean, if okay, here's an example. So Galileo, whatever, I don't know. I'm really bad at coming up with really lucid examples off the top of my head, but Galileo, he discovered that the moon had mountains and valleys on it. Of course, that's not really what he saw through his telescope. What he saw through his telescope were little points of light and shadow on the moon. It was kind of two-dimensional, and he had to infer, oh, it's probably actually mountains because the points of light change depending on what time of day it is or what time of night it is, and it must be that the angle of the sun is hitting these peaks on the moon at different angles and so on. And from that, he infers that, there really are mountains and valleys on the moon.
Right.
And so, and here, trying to make this example clear, other people that looked through the telescope only saw the points of light and the shadows. They didn't see the mountains. And Galileo at first didn't see the mountains either. He had to kind of theorize about it before he could see those points of light as mountains.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so subjectively, he sees points of lights and shadows, and that's all he sees until he theorizes about it. And his
Right.
opponents that don't want to grant him that there are mountains on the moon only see the points of light. So epistemically, it's just points of light from a subjective point of view. Right. Ontologically, there's an objective fact of the matter it's objective, and it's that no, mountains really are on the moon. Epistemically, we have the subjective point of view that no, it's just points of light on the moon. Until you through theorizing about it, realize, oh, those points of light just are the mountains on the moon.
Right.
Right. And then you've moved from a subjective epistemology of what's going on the moon, from points of light, to an objective epistemology. Oh, there are mountains on the moon, but the ontological state of affairs hasn't changed. It's always been objectively true that there were mountains on the moon.
Yeah.
Right? Is that clear? Okay. And in that case, we don't need other people, opponents of Galileo. Galileo had that shift himself because he went from, oh, there are weird points of light on the moon that change location, whatever, to, oh, there are mountains on the moon.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So here's the thing that should be really clear, because that's like a very common sense understanding of there are objective things in the world. We have points of view. Sometimes our points of view make it hard to know what the objective state of affairs is, but sometimes we can objectively know what is objectively there in the world.
Right.
Here's something unique about consciousness. Its ontology is subjective. Right? So that means that it's not just that, we think that we have consciousness, and no, we're wrong. It's really just brain waves or, brain neurons firing or whatever. And if we really understand the objective state of affairs, we'll realize that we don't really have consciousness. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Because we have consciousness. It's an immediate phenomenon that we experience. But the phenomenon only exists subjectively.
Yeah.
There is no the the objective ontology of consciousness might be the brain waves or the brain patterns or whatever, but there's also a subjective ontology, which is the phenomenon of consciousness.
Right.
If you try to reduce the phenomenon of consciousness to just the physical states, you're actually losing consciousness. You're not explaining consciousness by reducing it to brain states.
So you're losing the ness. So like, let's say when I say redness, the
well, yeah, I mean, that's one property of consciousness on these accounts generally, that consciousness has a qualitative dimension, right? That, it's what's the difference between knowledge? Well, like Mary, the color scientist, Frank Jackson's paper about what Mary knew. She's a color scientist, and she lives in a black and white world, and she knows everything you could possibly know about color from an objective point of view. In other words, she has an objective epistemology of the objective ontology of color.
Mm-hmm.
But what she's lacking is an objective epistemology of the subjective ontology of color, which is the qualia of color. Right. Okay, but that's the idea. So it's like, if you try to reduce consciousness to physical states, then you're not actually explaining consciousness. I mean, here's a way to say that basic problem, which will show how kind of, self-refuting it seems. If I tell you consciousness, you don't really have consciousness.
Mm.
Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe another way of just kind of describing it, although this is still sort of a third personal way of showing the self-contradictory quality of that statement. But, if you're consciously denying that you have consciousness, it seems like it's a self-refuting statement. How can you consciously deny consciousness?
Right.
Right. And this is basically what's at the heart of Descartes' thought experiment. Just that, you can't deny that you're thinking, because to deny is already to think.
Right.
Right. So, yeah, that's basically the idea.
I read the like a few chapters from the book, something, it's called Something About Mary, but it's like basically a bunch of philosophers just like writing their take on like the Mary question. And I was just looking at my notes, and I just like had this question written: if a synesthete experiences red for the first time, let's say Mary was a synesthete, how does that affect the argument?
Yeah, it's interesting. Synesthesia. Yeah, I don't really, it's hard for me to imagine. The other thing is, people are really cagey when they talk about synesthesia generally, right? Like if you really ask them, oh, so you really just see like a big block of red? And then they're usually like, no, not really. I don't really see red, like, like there's some color filter on the world.
Yeah.
What I do is have this really strong experience of something that feels like what it feels like when I experience red.
Right.
But then you're not actually seeing red.
No, yeah.
And so, I mean, I know that there are certain numbers that I associate with colors. I don't know why I do that. Like 7 is yellow, is green, 6 is red ish. I mean, and I'm using the word red. Actually, it's a very specific shade of red that I just know that I kind of associate with these numbers. But I don't think of myself as having synesthesia, because it's not like when I see the number 7 or think the number 7, I just see yellow. It's just that I if you're asking me what color is 7, without any doubt in my mind, I would say it's this kind of golden yellow color.
Yeah.
But I don't know why. I just associate 7 with that color.
Yeah.
but that's a lot different from actually seeing yellow. Although I can imagine yellow, I can
Right.
imagine a shade of yellow. Um, but I also, wonder with synesthesia how much of it is, if you do have this really strong association or this strong, maybe even experience of color, is that only possible because you've seen colors in your life,
Hmm.
right? I mean, are there colorblind synesthetes? And if so, does their synesthesia accord with their colorblindness?
Yeah.
In other words, when they, when they hear a C major chord, do they see a specific shade of gray?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? So those sorts of questions are, I suppose, you could do social psychological experiments and ask people what I mean. It's really hard to know exactly what sort of experiment. It seems like it should be an empirical fact. The problem is just that qualia also have a subjective ontology because they're part of their necessary property of consciousness for most people that believe that we actually have qualia.
Yeah.
And they're unique, right? Everybody has different qualia,
Right.
right? So how are you going to actually? It is an empirical question. The only problem is that the objective facts will change from person to person, and there's no way you can actually see inside,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But I don't know. I feel very. We were supposed to talk about Schopenhauer, but we'll see what happens. Um, you know, the whole question of qualia is really kind of it's confusing because I've often thought so. Like Daniel Dennett is famous for denying that we have qualia.
Mhm.
But the way that he doesn't exactly deny that we have qualia, what he does is say, look, the way we've defined qualia, the way we've tried to express something qualitative in discursive language, well, those definitions fail.
Mm.
That's what he's shown, that the definitions fail. The definitions don't actually, they're either self-contradictory or they lead to dilemmas where you can't decide between two opposing interpretations or two opposing consequences. They can't both be true, but uh, both consequences follow from the definition. This sort of thing. If you're interested in that, there's a famous article that he wrote called "Quining Qualia,"
Mm.
um, where he talks about um, problems with the concept qualia. That's not the same as to deny that we actually have a qualitative aspect to our experience.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems kind of crazy to me to deny that we have uh, qualia, but it does also seem to me that when we try to talk about qualia, all sorts of problems arise. Like, for instance, one thing is we often describe qualia. Let's take a specific qualia. Like, for instance, there's a Thomas Nagel's thing, What It's Like to Be a Bat. You may have read about that. As though there's a specific
Mm.
localizable, unique entity,
Right.
which is the what it's like to be a bat, right? Or even what it's like to experience sonar or that sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that that's right. It seems to me that it's some very complex network of a bunch of different experiences that are a lot easier to describe in physical terms, right? That being said, though, all of those physical processes or physical, experiences um, do combine to create the sense that there is something qualitatively identifiable,
Yeah.
right? Um, but it seems to me that when we talk about a quale, actually, you can't really localize it
Yeah.
as a specific, um, entity that has exactly one predicate
Yeah.
to it. It's all sorts of different things that we, I think, sort of synthesize into a concept or something like that. I don't know. It's hard to say exactly because the idea is that qualia aren't actually conceptual. or just sort of this immediate awareness of what it's like to have an experience.
Mhm.
Um, and I guess maybe the problem really only arises when you try to express it as a concept, try to give it a definition, and because what you're trying to do is turn it into a specific object, basically an object of consciousness or something like that. But then if it's true that any quale is actually something that is better expressed as a configuration of a huge network of underlying experiences, then it's going to be very hard to pinpoint exactly what the quale is.
Yeah.
It's actually something that emerges out of a network of experiences. And also, I guess there's some question about whether or not, if you're talking about a quale, is it always the same? If I see red now, I mean, I sort of feel like I know what red looks like. But it's also true that humans are extremely bad at differentiating, differentiating shades of red when they're not right next to each other.
Yeah,
In
right.
other words, if I show you red 7 and then I show you red 9 and it's slightly different, they're right next to each other, you can tell the difference. But if I show you red 7 and you say, yeah, I know what it feels like to see red 7, and then 2 hours later I show you red 9,
Yeah.
you're going to be like, I don't know, is that the same? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
then that means that maybe there's not really a specific quality of what it's like to see red. It's always going to be contextual, right? There's always something about the context of this huge network of experiences that you use to you use to recognize objects and that sort of thing, or recognize experiences, recognize the qualitative aspect of experiences and so on.
Yeah, that kind of takes me back to what you were saying about moving from something that's epistemic
Yeah.
to objective to something that's like ontologically objective. And I think with like even just like that experiment where you're showing two different shades of red to someone else, like, I mean, I just don't know if there's like some red shade of red that's like ontologically objective. And
Well, yeah, I mean, there would be, right? So, like, let's say that I show you red 7. I don't know what the numbers are in color, design or whatever, but let's just say there's red 7 and red 9 has slightly more green in it or something like that. Whatever, it doesn't matter. It's just a different shade of red. Um, you know, Even if I go back and forth through a bunch of different shades and then I show you red 7 again and I ask you, was that the first shade of red you saw? You'd be like, I don't know.
hmm,
Well, there's an objective fact of the matter. Yeah, it is the same. I can show you the wavelengths, you
yeah,
know, it's the same color, but you don't know that it's the same color, or at least you can't be sure that it's the same color.
yeah,
So then there isn't this immediate sort of sense certainty of the experience of seeing the shade,
yeah.
right? There's this vague sort of sense of, well, it's red, I guess, but colors are really weird. I've been getting into color theory because well, next year you'll probably be my TA for 302, and you'll see what I do with this. But I talk about Goethe, the poet Goethe, quite a lot because Goethe is really interesting. He was also a scientist
Oh, yeah,
and wrote this 40-year long. He had this 40-year long research project where he was studying color,
yeah.
color perception, and how color arises in the interplay of light and shadow. It's really interesting.
Schopenhauer was kind of influenced by him, right?
Who?
Schopenhauer, didn't he
Uh,
write a little treatise on
I
vision
mean,
and
oh, that's right. That's right. Yes, yeah, that is right. And I think that was directly influenced by Goethe's what is it called? So Farbenlehre is what it is in German. In English, I think it's color theory or theory of colors. Yeah, that was published in 1810. So I think Schopenhauer was a little bit later. But anyway, the point is that not so much to talk about Goethe, but that the way that we come to experience colors is really very context dependent, incredibly context dependent. let's see, I might even have something. Yeah, okay. I have let me share my screen. It just so happens that right before I met with you, I was looking up a few of these. Okay, so look at A and B.
Mm-hmm.
On an objective, absolute level, they're the exact same shade of gray.
Oh, okay.
It's just the same shade of gray, but it seems like that's impossible, right?
Yeah.
There's no way you can see that as being the same shade of gray until I let's see. Oh God, I have so many Zoom windows here. Let me move you over to my other screen so that I can access this. Okay, so but if I show you this, now you
Uh-huh.
can they really are the same shade.
Mm.
Well, that's weird.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it that your qualitative experience of seeing gray isn't the same? Objectively, it's just the same shade.
Yeah.
But the qualia are just wrong then.
Yeah.
Right? It's you don't have the qualia of seeing what it's like to see this shade of gray, or really, I mean, there are other experiments where you'll have like a table full of fruit and other, really colorful objects, but it'll have a color filter on it. And then
Mm-hmm.
it'll be the exact same photo with a different color. And then it'll be weird things like you have green grapes and an orange. And with one color filter, you see the grapes is green and you see the orange is orange. And with another color filter, you see the grapes is green and the orange is orange. But it just so happens, objectively, in one picture, the grapes are the same color as the orange in the other picture.
Mm.
So, in other words, you don't have the qualia of seeing green,
Yeah.
or, it's, I think what one way of describing this, and this is an article I'd really love to go through with you at some point. It doesn't require that much formal logic, so I think we could probably do it. But what's going on is something that Wilfred Sellers describes. This idea that perceptual experience is always already theory laden, right?
Mm-hmm.
That when I say I know what it is to see green, what I'm really saying
Mm-hmm.
is I have a conjecture of what it is like for an ideal viewer under very specific lighting conditions to see this color and to know the way that that color would change given different lighting conditions and that kind of thing, right? That there's this huge theoretical apparatus that's operating in the background of perception, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is probably, it's not like a knockdown argument against qualia, but it does sort of seem like, well, if that's the case,
Mm-hmm.
if when I see green, I'm really positing all this theoretical knowledge, well, that's not qualitative,
Yeah.
right? It's theoretical.
Right.
And these color illusions, I think, are a good example of this sort of thing, right? Where it's like, well, no, actually, you don't have the qualitative, immediate awareness of what it's like to see a specific shade, right?
Yeah.
'Cause I can show you that objectively you're seeing the same shade, and yet um, you don't see it as the same. And the reason you don't see it the same is that part of the experience of the color is an awareness of the context,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that, you know, it's through the context that the colors arise as the colors that they are.
Yeah.
And somewhere operating in the background is an awareness that colors are all context dependent,
Yeah.
right? Instead of just these specific, like, I know what it feels like to see red. Well, no, you don't.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
on the other hand, maybe the better approach to it is not to deny that we have qualia when we see color, that sort of thing, but just to say that all mental experiences, even theoretical mental experiences, have qualia,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that would be, so, if Wilfred Sellers is saying, well, behind the experiential level, you have a theoretical level, what's to stop us from saying, yeah, but that theoretical level also has a qualitative level, In other
Mm-hmm.
words, there is a feeling of what it's like to understand something,
Something. Yeah.
and in this case, there is a feeling of what it's like to see two colors that you take to be different and then to realize that they're the same color. I mean, it's
Yeah.
like, there was a qualitative aspect to that experience, right? Well, that's a theoretical mental experience. I go from confusion to a demonstration of the causes of my confusion to an awareness that, or to a resolution of the confusion. I see, oh, they actually are the same colors. That's all theoretical, but there's a feeling of what it's like to have that experience. Now,
Yeah.
here's the thing that I would say to that. I don't know that anybody has, I'm sure somebody's talked about this before, but my sense is that that might be true, that theoretical mental experiences do have a qualitative aspect to them. But in my own experience, the qualia of theoretical mental experiences is always really general. In other words, I don't think there's a different quale um, associated with, for instance, understanding that those points of light on the moon really are just mountains, and understanding that these different colors are actually one and the same color. Like the actual quality of that moment of understanding just seems to be the same thing. It feels the same to me to suddenly go from confusion to understanding, or not really confusion, right? Because we're not confused. What's going on is we see phenomenon one, these colors are different. Or in Galileo's case, phenomenon one, there are points of light on the moon. And then through various demonstrations and theoretical reconfiguration, we go to an understanding, oh no, these are the same color. And
Yeah.
Galileo, oh, actually, there are mountains on the moon. So
Yeah.
it's the same sort of process of understanding, going from one phenomenon that you take to be real to another phenomenon where you realize, after having analyzed it, that something else is going on. For me, the qualitative aspect of that is the same.
Of both those phenomenons.
Yeah,
Hmm.
right. It's not like that moment of understanding. I'm just taking Galileo. I wasn't there. I haven't actually done that. But you could take any example where you have a phenomenon that you take to be the case, then
Yeah.
you realize that actually that's not right. A different phenomenon is the case. And
Mhm.
usually that's associated with this sort of click in your brain. When people say it clicked for me, well, that's, I think, a description of the qualia of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that yes, that's probably true, but that qualia, that qualitative aspect of it is the same from one moment of understanding to another moment of understanding in totally different problems.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay.
If I see red and I see green, there's a different qualitative experience. But if I understand problem one and then I understand problem two, it's the same qualitative experience.
Hmm. And
It's
so,
not that there's, like there's a unique qualitative experience of understanding that these are the same colors versus understanding that some other color illusion is operating in a similar way, or even in the case of Galileo, that the points of light on the moon are really mountains. That moment of understanding does have a qualitative aspect, but all moments of understanding have the same qualitative aspect.
oh, okay.
That's from my own experience. I can't say that that is true for everybody, but
And that's a general statement you're making, all moments of, or is it?
well, I would say as far as I can, imagine or remember, it's true that theoretical mental events have
Mm-hmm.
a qualitative aspect,
Mm-hmm.
but as far as I'm concerned, uh, maybe there are different classes of theoretical mental events, but the specific example that I'm describing is where you have phenomenon one, which you take to be true,
Mm-hmm.
then you realize that it's not true, and you realize that phenomenon two is true.
Yeah.
And that's associated with understanding. And any series of experiences that follows that pattern, from my point of view, has the same qualia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. because the theoretical qualia is different from um, just like the experiential. I don't know how
Oh,
what the
no, that's not quite right. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, okay, so you see green and you see red,
Mhm,
and you're like, I know what it feels like to see green. I know what it feels like to see red,
mhm.
right? So you have two different colors, but um, they both have different qualia, which is to say, as regards the sensation of color, there are many different qualia.
Right. Yeah.
There's the quality of what it's like to see red, the quality of what it's like to see turquoise, the quality of what it's like to see green.
Yeah.
And if you want to say that, um, say non-perceptual mental events also have qualia, right? For instance, that moment that you understand something that you were confused about,
Yeah.
or maybe not confused about, but really believed to be, something other than what it was, like here with these colors, these shades of gray, right? What I'm saying is, from my own phenomenal experience, that moment of understanding always has the same qualia. There's always the feeling of that clicking is always the same. It doesn't matter what the problem is.
Oh, okay. I see. Hmm. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's
That,
interesting.
that's I don't know. Maybe there are people where it's like, that feeling of understanding really changes from problem to problem.
Yeah.
But I don't experience that. I experience that moment that, oh, I get it, as having the same quality regardless of what the thing is that I just got.
Yeah. And it just might be different in intensity.
Well, it might be different in intensity, and that's just going to be a function of how frustrated I am about the problem.
Yeah.
you know. But like for instance, with this, I think it's nice because you're not frustrated about the problem. You just take it to be two different colors, and you realize, oh, it wasn't two different colors. That's weird. Well, that moment of that's weird has a qualia to it.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that any moment like that, regardless of what you're looking at,
That's the same.
regardless of the problem you're thinking about, where it's like, oh, I guess it really was the same thing or whatever,
Mm.
that is really just the same qualia. And it's not really comparable to perceptual qualia, wherein, if you think that specific instance of understanding has the same qualia regardless of what the example is. If you compare that to color sensation, it's not that all instances of color sensation have the same qualia. If you see red, it's a different qualia from if you see green,
Mm.
right? So that's what I'm saying, that it's probably true that non-perceptual and mental events do have a qualitative aspect to them. It's just that from my own experience, it's really general.
Mm.
It's
Mm.
not nearly as precise and specific as an aesthetic experience or a perceptual experience,
Mm.
right?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And so, if that's true, then I think that that's a really significant difference between, theoretical mental events and perceptual mental events.
Yeah.
Because even if it's true that the theoretical mental events do have a qualitative aspect,
Mm.
something incredibly general about them,
Yeah.
which is really just to say that theoretical descriptions of a phenomenon are always much more general than the phenomenon itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if I want to describe to you exactly what I have a pencil that I'm holding in my hand. I'm not showing it to you. And I try as hard as I can to describe it in all its detail. It's never going to be as detailed as your immediate perception of it, right? So there's always going to be something general about the description, which is really a theoretical way of presenting it,
Mm-hmm.
which is to say that theoretical mental events always have this sort of generality to them that is not true of perceptual mental events.
Yeah. I'm just trying to imagine it for myself. Like, let's say I figured out some problem or something, and I guess when I figure it out, let's say I have some sort of an experience or whatever, but when I'm thinking, the quality of thinking about the problem seems very general. Um, like if I were to
Example, so I can kind of see if it gels with my own experience.
Well, just even now, you talking about you giving me your own example and me thinking about the problem that you just posited.
Mhm.
Um, and for me, like the qualia of just thinking about whatever you just posited seems like very general. Like I can't pinpoint and say like this is how I'm feeling right now while just like thinking about this problem.
I
Uh,
wonder, I
yeah.
wonder if that's just a way of describing that it's hard for you to imagine an example, right? Because
Mm,
I think you'd want to like, um, you'd probably want to pick apart what you mean when you say it's hard for me to understand the example or something like that. I think what you're probably saying is something like, it's hard for me to imagine an example instead of I understand all of the say components or all the premises of the argument. I just don't see how the conclusion follows. Right. That's a little bit different from saying I don't understand because it's hard for me to imagine an example of what you're talking about.
mm,
And if it is that, then that's basically like saying it's hard for me to experience the qualia of something I can't imagine. Well, yeah, that's true. That's
mhm,
always the case. Like if I tell you, oh, by the way, there's this really beautiful ultraviolet um painting or whatever. Let's say I or like, don't you love it when the sun is setting and you get all these ultraviolet light, you get all these ultraviolet light rays? Doesn't it, isn't it beautiful? Doesn't it, it's just this amazing feeling. And it just so happens that I'm some alien that can actually perceive ultraviolet light. Well, you wouldn't have access to the qualia because you can't possibly imagine what it's like to see ultraviolet light,
mhm,
right? And that's really the same thing here. It's like if what you're saying is I can't really access the qualia of that theoretical example, if what you mean is because I can't imagine an experiential example of it, that's really just saying, yeah, I don't have the access to the qualia because it's not something I could experience,
mm.
right? But anyway, that's not what I was talking about. What I was talking about was, you know,
Yeah, I think I kind of I get it. Like I guess like okay, just to put it as an example, let's say I somehow figure out that God doesn't exist or
okay,
something,
sure.
and I have that moment of clicking or aha, and I guess what you're saying is like the qualia of that moment, um, speaking like theoretically, I guess, right?
Well,
Is
yeah, I mean,
is
that's a tricky example because what I would say is, look, there are types of mental event, or let's say even better than this, there are types of theoretical mental events, in other words, not perceptual mental events, that may have different qualia.
okay.
In other words, the example you're giving of determining that God doesn't exist is a lot different from the theoretical example of seeing two colors as different and then realizing they're the same.
Hmm.
They're not really comparable. And so probably they would have different qualia.
Okay.
Because in the one example, you're really seeing something that you take to be distinct, and then it's demonstrated that they're the same.
Yeah.
But in the case of God, you never experienced God to begin with,
Hmm.
right? And also, your certainty that God doesn't exist is not really comparable to your certainty that those two colors are the same when I demonstrate that they're the same.
Hmm.
So, yes, there would be a qualitative aspect to determining for yourself that God doesn't exist, but it would probably be a different qualitative experience because it's not that same clicking of aha,
Right.
right? And so, yeah, I think that there are types of theoretical mental event that would probably have different qualia because with the case of God, um, it's at least in principle possible that you would go from that determination of God doesn't exist to again not being sure if God exists or not.
Hmm.
Whereas with the color, once I show you that they're the same, it's really hard to see them as not the same. I mean, as long as you don't look at that vertical bar on it, you can say, okay, they're different. But as soon as you look at the vertical bars, like they're the same. I can't see them as not the same. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an aspect shift in perception, right? And sort of like if you draw the outlines of a box, a 3D box on a 2D plane, you can see it as flipped in different directions, but you can't see both directions at the same time. That's an aspect shift. It's the same sort of thing with the color. That's a lot different from God, because even if you sort of determine for yourself that God doesn't exist, you don't have the immediate sense certainty where it's impossible for you to now see God as possibly existing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you always have the option of saying, well, maybe my calculations are wrong or whatever. Whereas when you see the colors are really the same, you can't say, well, no, I choose not to see them as the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Uh-huh.
Maybe it's similar. I mean, with the case of the box, you can go between one aspect or the other aspect. And with the case of God, you can go between determining that God exists or determining that God doesn't exist, and they can't both happen at the same time. But it does seem to me that well, maybe there is something to that. I mean, maybe if you're really determined, if you really believe that your argument is right, there's a qualitative aspect to really believing that your argument is right. And there's a different qualitative experience when you realize that it's possible that your argument is wrong.
Yeah.
So I don't know, maybe there's
There
something.
seems like
Yeah.
then you need some necessary conditions to uh for your to posit your theory. Like I think there needs to be something that's ontologically objective in order to experience that same quality theoretically every time or something,
Well, that's right. You would have to, right, exactly. I mean, that's one of the other problems with qualia. Very often when qualia are used as an argument against physicalism, against the idea that consciousness is basically physical, there's this idea that one, they're certain, that there's this sort of immediate certainty to them, which suggests that then they don't change, right? That means that every time you see red, you have the same qualitative experience of seeing red. But if they really are different each time, then it's not the same qualitative experience, right? And so then the question is, well, how can we determine the sort of objective reality of it being one and the same qualia each time, right? Because actually, I think the subject experience of the qualia probably can't be certain, although I'm not sure. These are the sorts of things that Dennett talks about in that article about qualia, where it's like, and really, again, it's not that you're denying that we have qualitative experience if you're denying the idea that you have certainty of the qualitative experience, because even if it changed each time, you might still have qualitative experience. All that we're showing is that if we try to define qualia in terms of this immediate sense certainty, that definition can't really hold, because it's possible to imagine that it's different each time and you wouldn't know whether or not it was different.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that you don't experience something qualitative, right? And anyway, this is very fascinating. Actually, this is the stuff I've been reading. I've been reading a lot of philosophy of mind stuff.
Is this for
my own benefit? But so actually, it's what's fresh in my mind right now, more so than Schopenhauer. I had to go over all my notes with Schopenhauer. But I don't know what do you want to do about Schopenhauer? Because we really have to cover. I would say the most important thing to cover is in the Stanford article, the more general article about Schopenhauer, not his aesthetics, the segment on the fourfold root of the PSR, and in particular this idea of the principium individuationis, this idea that knowledge and the idea of causality and the idea of reason necessarily presupposes distinction, individuality.
Mhm.
Was that clear? Can you summarize that to me? If it's really clear and you know it by heart, then
No, no, no. Yeah. So I guess the way I thought of it is like that there are certain or there are objects or what he calls like maybe to use constant term like thing in itself that's outside of PSR that exists
yeah.
or reality and space and time and whatnot. And then when these objects present themselves as maybe as ideas or concepts within the PSR.
Okay, I think there's probably a more straightforward way to summarize it. I would say probably one of the better ways to get into it is to start with what he thinks is wrong with Kant's account. And it's basically this: he thinks that there's something incoherent about the idea of the thing in itself.
Yeah.
Do you remember what that was?
Yeah, just to like posit something that exists outside our modes of perception that's just like inaccessible to us.
Yeah,
Why?
basically right. But yeah, okay. So here's a really quick way of summarizing it. Causality is a category of understanding. It's I have to go back and look at Kant's own terminology, but that you know how there are like two different formulations of the categories of understanding. One is like the general logical formulation, and then one is the categories of understanding as they apply to objects.
Oh yeah, this is
If you
from
remember that, that's in the critique of pure reason. We talked about that a little bit. Causality is so on a logical level, there's necessity, right? So there's what is it? It's possibility, actuality, necessity, I think is what it is. And then those categories as they apply to objects, necessity turns into causality.
Mm,
Okay, so what Kant is saying is that perception is structured by the categories of understanding into experience of objects, into objective experience. Well, that means that causality is in the mind and causality is structuring what we perceive into objects. And it's less of a problem if you take a third personal account. So this is like David Hume and the billiard balls, right? Okay, so like you see one ball hit the other one and it moves. And Hume says, well, it's just a habit of our mind that we say that it's a necessary connection. Necessarily, the second ball will move. And then what Kant says is, no, it's not just habit. There's something transcendentally necessary about the structure of our minds that enables a necessary condition of experience is this category of causality. We wouldn't experience the things as balls or having relationships or anything without already presupposing causality.
yeah.
Right? Okay, so that makes sense from a third personal point of view. Where does the necessity come from in that relationship of one ball hitting the other? Well, it comes from the structure of understanding, the specific category of causality.
Mm-hmm.
What Schopenhauer says is that works fine in the third person, but it doesn't work in the second person.
Mm.
Because what Kant is saying is that there's a thing in itself which gives us the content of our experiences. In other words, at least as regards filling out the content of the categories of understanding, there's a causal relationship between the thing in itself and our objective experience.
Yeah.
How is that possible if causality is a mental category?
Mm-hmm.
How does
Mm.
that causality get from the thing in itself into us if
Yeah,
causality begins with us
that's here. Right.
right from the outset? So that's basically the problem that he sees, that there's something wrong with this idea that we don't have access to the thing in itself, and yet at the same time it causes our experiences.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm.
That's what he says. I think that Schopenhauer has a way of saving the idea of the thing in itself, and I think that that's probably the better way to think about what it is, to think of the thing in itself as just a formal description of experience instead of an actually existing object. A thing in itself is simply a thing as it exists when it's not being perceived or understood by us. Right. That's there's just a formal description. It's sort of those aspects of a thing that we don't pick up in our perceptual field, or that we're not aware of because they don't conform to the way that we understand the world, or this sort of thing. Well, you could describe that as a formal description of the object simply outside of our modes of awareness.
Yeah.
Which isn't to say that it's like a separately existing object or something.
Mm-hmm.
Still, even there, it is hard to see how it's possible that the thing in itself can have that causal relationship to experience, how it can be the cause of our objective experience, at least as regards its content.
Yeah.
One thing that people have often said, this also goes for space and time, is that you should probably think of that causal efficacy of the thing in itself not as a property of the object, but rather as a property that arises in the relationship between the subject and the object. And the example, the analogy that is often brought up is the idea of poison. So, like you take some snake and they have venom. The venom itself is not poisonous. It's only poisonous in the way that it interacts with us. Right. And so there is something in us that makes it poisonous.
Yeah.
But it's not that the venom isn't poisonous, and it's not that poison exists in us. It's that there's something about the relationship in our interaction with the poison that from which emerges a further property of, snake venom, our biology together yields poison.
Yeah.
And that's probably the best way to think about the thing in itself having some kind of causal interaction with us.
Yeah.
Just a second. Anyway, so you can save concept analysis, although I think that Schopenhauer's objection is good. It's just that you have to think of causality as probably not really being in the mind as a category, as Kant says, but being and also space and time not really being just in our mind, but rather that space and time are something that emerge in the interaction between our modes of understanding and the object.
Yeah.
Poison arises out of the interaction of the snake venom and our biology.
Right.
And the confusion only arises when you think, oh no, there's a separate entity out there.
Yeah.
No, the thing in itself is just a formal description of the same entity.
Yeah.
Anyway, what Schopenhauer then argues is that, okay, so it's a problem that the thing in itself has a causal relationship to us, or has some kind of causal power, because causality starts with us. So how could it have causal power? It's outside us, and then what he wants to say is, okay, so maybe one way of solving that problem is to say that the thing in itself is not inaccessible. Right? That would be another way of solving the problem, saying, okay, well, Kant, you're wrong that the thing in itself is inaccessible.
Right.
Right. If it's inaccessible, then it can't possibly hook up with us.
Right.
For causality. But if it is accessible, then it could.
Right.
And then what he wants to say is that, actually, it turns out we do have awareness of at least one thing in itself.
Yeah.
You remember what it is?
This is like through art? Are you
talking? No. We're not to art yet.
Okay. So there's just, just like the immediate experience of the immediate subjective experience. He says like that's undeniable, and
not quite. Okay, here's another way of framing the problem. If you say that it's the immediate subjectivity of experience, right, then you still have the problem that Descartes and I think Kant also had, that there's a world in itself and there's the subject. And the subject is somehow outside the world in itself, and maybe, is sort of trying to look at the world in itself, but is not itself in the world.
Mhm.
Subjectivity is separate from the world in itself, right?
Mhm.
And what Schopenhauer wants to say is we're not disembodied minds outside the world. We're also in the world
Mhm.
because we have bodies.
Yeah.
We have immediate bodily experience in addition to mental experience.
Uh-huh. Oh, maybe time? No?
No, time would be mental, right? Time is still mental for Schopenhauer. Time is a form of intuition, just like it is with Kant. So Schopenhauer takes space and time as forms of intuition, and he reduces all of the categories, the 12 categories, to one category, causality.
Yeah.
He says you can derive all of Kant's categories from one category of causality in relation to space and time. So here's the idea, basically. There's one thing in itself that we have access to.
Mm.
Each person has access to one thing in itself directly, and that is their own body as an object.
Mm.
You have direct awareness or connection, at least. You have direct connection to the thing in itself of your own physical body,
Mm.
right? That's the idea.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because, and I think it's a really cool move because, Kant is, Kant's philosophy and Descartes' philosophy and a lot of modern philosophy all happens from the neck up.
Yeah.
It's this idea of, Descartes actually says, well, no, the physical world is actually false. It's not real. What is real is the mental world. And actually, Kant has basically the same sort of idea, although he's a little bit more scientific than Descartes. But both of them hold that the mental world is the true world. The noumenal, in the case of Kant,
Right.
the world of clear and distinct ideas for Descartes. And what Schopenhauer is saying, yes, that exists, that subjective world of thought. But in addition to that, we also are in the world. Because with Descartes, what he says is, look, I can deny that anything exists. I can imagine my body disappearing and yet me still being there.
Yeah.
Right? You can imagine standing in front of a mirror and you just get rid of everything physical, but you can still look in the mirror somehow, weirdly. For
Yeah.
Descartes, it's enough to show that body and mind are separate things, and what's real is mind, because you can get rid of the body and still have a presence, but you can't get rid of the mind and still have a presence.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
And what Schopenhauer is trying to show is no, actually, we aren't just these, disembodied minds looking at the world. We are also bodies in the world.
Right.
And it's through our body that we have direct, immediate access to the thing in itself.
Mhm.
Because we know what it's like to be the thing in itself. That is our physical body.
Mhm. Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, right. And so that's basically the way that he solves that problem
Yeah.
of the the problem of the thing in itself. He just says, look, we have access to the thing in itself because it's our body. And then he actually makes a move that I don't think it's really a logical fallacy. It's induction. So like the difference between deduction and induction.
No. Well,
Oh,
maybe I can understand just, but induction, I'm not sure.
oh, okay. Well, that's a really basic kind of concept to be clear on. But deduction is basically where a conclusion follows necessarily from premises,
Mhm.
and induction is where it follows contingently from premises. But here's the thing: the way that deduction works is that you reason from a universal to a specific case.
Yeah.
In other words, all dogs are mammals. My dog Harvey, this guy in my room, you can't see him, but Harvey is a dog. Therefore, Harvey is a mammal. Well, I've gotten to the truth of this specific case. Harvey is a mammal from reasoning from all dogs are mammals. So I
Yeah.
go from the universal to the particular. Induction goes in the opposite direction. Induction goes from specific cases to a general rule. So, in
Mhm.
other words, I do 600 scientific experiments and I show that something stupid. Every time I drop a billiard ball, it falls at what is it? Um, I think it's S equals DT, dt squared or something like that, whatever right. So I reason from all these all of these experiments to a general rule.
Yeah.
That I describe as a mathematical formula, right? But I'm going from specific experiments to a general rule.
Right.
And that's induction.
Okay.
Most scientific experimentation is inductive. It's not deductive. Deductive is where I say, look, you are a human and all humans are mammals, so therefore you are a mammal. The warrant for that is from the universal premise or the universal proposition, all humans are mammals. That's how I know that you're a mammal.
Hmm.
But
So
in the
again,
case of induction, I say there's a regularity. It's usually the case, or every time I've tested it, it's been the case that this has happened. Therefore, I reason that there's a universal rule.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But you can see there, to be really, really strict about it, that's actually a fallacy.
mm-hmm,
Because you don't know that the universal is true. Maybe someday there will be a counterexample.
mm-hmm.
But you just say that every time it's ever been tested, the same thing happened. And so therefore we reason it must be a general rule.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's fine as far as it goes for science, because science isn't really about discovering these universal truths. It's about discovering regularities and making predictions.
Yeah.
If there's a regularity 100% of the time, then you can usually predict that it's going to happen the next time too.
Right.
Here's the problem with Schopenhauer's reasoning. You only have one case,
Uh-huh.
your body.
Yeah.
And from that, he wants to then reason that because we have direct awareness of one thing in ourselves, one thing in itself, our bodies, we therefore can also know something about all things in themselves.
Mm-hmm. You're right. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like, yeah, it's kind of a hard, I don't know how else he could have gone about it.
Yeah, probably not if he wants to. This is the same. I don't know if you've encountered these guys. They're really fashionable now in, language departments and, postmodern composers that want to show that generally know nothing about philosophy, but want to like talk the talk. And so they just look up who is the most contemporary living philosopher that, writes librettos for Rebecca Saunders or whatever. So there's this guy Graham Harmon, another guy Timothy Morton or Timothy Horton. I don't remember Horton or Tim Morton, I think is what it is.
These are philosophers or?
Yeah, they're well, sort of. Graham Harmon is an actual philosopher. Tim Morton is uh, he's like a writer, but he writes about philosophical ideas. Let me see if I'm getting his name right, actually. Yeah, Timothy Morton, Morton. Anyway, they are figures in this movement called
Oh,
object-oriented ontology, OOO.
okay.
I don't know if you've encountered this. It kind of annoys me, although on another level, I kind of like it too. But they do the same basic thing that Schopenhauer does, which is reasoning from our own experience that there's a certain structure to our experience that is not theoretical, that is not conscious exactly, that is sort of procedural or based in the way that we, carry out practices, right?
Hmm.
Are you know what I mean when I say procedural knowledge? Like it's knowledge that is not theoretical. In other
Hmm.
words, how do you know how to open a door?
Oh, I see.
How do you
Okay.
know how to walk? It's not like you're constantly thinking through the rules and the physical formulas of gravity and equilibrium and all that kind of stuff. That's all theoretical. No, you don't have that knowledge. And in fact, it's probably the case that that's not really what's going on in your mind when you walk, because dogs and all sorts of animals that don't have any sort of access to that theoretical knowledge nonetheless can do really complicated physical actions. Like,
Mm-hmm.
throw a ball in the air and somehow a dog predicts the exact arc and the velocity and the wind resistance and catches the ball.
Yeah.
It's not like the dog is going through these complex physical calculations,
Mm-hmm.
right? So then there's another sort of knowledge that is somehow like this biological knowledge that's not theoretical.
Yeah.
It's usually referred to as procedural knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And Heidegger has a really famous analysis of procedural knowledge, basically, that has to do with familiarity and mastery of certain physical events, like someone who's really good at, playing the piano isn't even thinking about how they're moving their fingers. Whereas if you've never played the piano, you have to think about every single thing, right? Okay. We can talk about that at some point. But the point is that these guys, Tim Morton, whatever, reason from that analysis that we can think of our own activity that way, to saying that we can think about all physical interactions that way, including between, particles or, inorganic objects or whatever. And that, so yeah, maybe. I mean, it's a very rich philosophy. They have all sorts of different claims and different stories about what's going on and how it must be similar to our own experience. And part of the rhetoric of this is that it decenters the human. Right? It's this idea that, like, the ecological crisis, global warming and everything, is a result of a worldview that puts humanity and rationality at the center as most important. Right? Because why are we allowed to, like, raise animals and kill them to, just to eat them? Why do we think that rationalizing transportation such that, we produce way more emissions than the Earth can actually sustain? It's this idea that rationality and human-centeredness is a huge problem in the world today. And so their whole project is to decenter the human by saying there's nothing special about consciousness. There's nothing special about humans. All of reality has the same basic structure and relationships and all that kind of thing, which is pretty much exactly what Schopenhauer's doing too, right? I mean, he's saying that actually human beings, it's probably better if human beings never existed to begin with, right? Yeah. But in both cases, there's this really problematic fallacy, which is that they reason from one unique case to all of reality.
Yeah, that's true.
And that means that it's all really, really speculative.
Yeah.
And I think that's fine if you treat it as fiction, as just a kind of interesting way of thinking about the world, but not as an actual explanation for the world.
Right.
Sorry, my dog is trying to jump. Let me just finish this out. I don't know. we do need to cover some stuff in Schopenhauer, but anyway. But the idea is that okay, so if you're telling me that you can use the same sort of analysis to describe rain falling in a forest as you can to me playing the piano. I mean, I think there's something kind of nice to think about that as a sort of figurative or poetic way of thinking about the world. But if you really want to say, no, I can prove it.
Yeah.
How are you going to prove, it's sort of like saying that consciousness, so it's actually related to panpsychism, if you're familiar with that, this idea that consciousness isn't special. It's not just that humans have consciousness, but consciousness exists in lower and lower levels through all reality. Okay, but that's really, really speculative. Are you really telling me that, my TV screen has phenomenal states, or, it has, I mean, that seems really, really ridiculous. And and even if it's true, there's no way that you could demonstrate it, or, there's not really even any reason why we should accept it, because on the face of it, it just seems like it's just wrong.
Yeah. Unless they define consciousness like completely differently or something.
Oh, but that's the thing about consciousness. If you do believe that it has a subjective ontology, that as soon as you start talking about consciousness in terms of physical events, you're not talking about consciousness anymore.
Something else, right? Yeah.
Right. And then it's sort of like, well, no, that doesn't make any sense to say that. Yeah, I mean, there are physical. Here's one way of saying it. A bar, an iron bar, a bar of metal, has some powers or some abilities that are similar to human consciousness. Namely, one thing human consciousness is able to do is make distinctions between things. Right? Well, an iron bar can make distinctions between things because if it rains, the bar will rust. A bar can distinguish between dry and wet.
Yeah.
right? And reacts accordingly, right? But if you want then to say that that's conscious on
Yeah.
some very rudimentary level, it doesn't really, I don't think it's true because there's no subjective ontology to it.
No. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the that's
Do.
basically what's wrong with that whole approach. And for me, I that's one of the reasons I like Kant a lot more than Hegel or even Heidegger or especially these people, because Kant puts himself in this position where it's he says, look, we can show that it's logically possible, but we shouldn't go from the idea that it's logically possible to saying that we can know it to be true.
Yeah.
Right? But we also can't say we can know it to be false. And so what we can do is look for hints in the world that might support what we want to be true,
Hmm.
but we'll never know.
Yeah.
And for me, there's something beautiful about that.
Yeah.
It's this sort of this feeling of hope that you look for clues for things that might support what you want to be the case, but also not to be really sort of authoritarian and tyrannical about what you want to be the case and say, no, it really is the case.
Right. Right. Right.
And so there's something really beautiful and fragile about Kant's ontology and epistemology, that we can at least hope that it's true and we can show that you can't prove it to be false.
Right.
But at the end of the day, there's always this mystery
Right.
about whether or not it really is true.
Yeah. Yeah.
That for me is just a beautiful kind of that it's that what's his compatibilism basically, right? But it's this beautiful, very fragile threshold position to be in.
Yeah.
I think people like Tim Morton or these people or Schopenhauer for that matter, who have these really, really robust metaphysical systems. We often think of Kant as being the as being a metaphysical thinker, but Kant himself thought of what he was doing as destroying most of metaphysics,
Mhm.
right? The metaphysics that came before Kant, Leibniz and whatnot, were all very robust in terms of the sorts of knowledge that we can have access to just by thinking.
Yeah.
Like God really exists or something. And what Kant does is say, no, you can't actually know any of that. You can show it to be logically possible, but you can't say you know it.
Mm. Mm.
But for whatever reason, even though Kant was quite influential, most of the people that come after Kant, I'd say Schopenhauer, Hegel, the whole, German idealists and so on, Heidegger as well, and today people like Tim Morton or Graham Harman, they want to go too far into the side of certainty, of a sort of metaphysical certainty, sort of
Mhm.
this idea that we really have robust metaphysical knowledge, which is weird because it sort of seems like they go from Leibniz straight to Hegel and totally forget about Kant.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one way of saying that also is that Kant is this interesting figure. Sometimes I've heard him referred to as what is it? The common ancestor of different species. That
Mm-hmm.
Kant is the common ancestor of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy.
Yeah.
That you can draw a lot of ideas in continental philosophy, you can draw them back to Kant, but Kant also believes that there's an important distinction between reason and knowledge
Mm.
that the continental figures tend to forget about, but that is important for analytic philosophy. Uh, and I think that's just a way to say that Kant is this sort of threshold figure that sort of wants to have both, metaphysical certainty and empirical knowledge, reducing knowledge to what can be studied empirically. But in a way, he also sort of loses both by trying
Yeah.
to have both. It's
Yeah.
not that he really loses both, and it's not that he has both, but he's sort of in this very fragile place in the middle.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe what makes it aesthetically beautiful is like it's almost like a tragedy in a way.
Yeah, exactly. There's something kind of tragic or, I mean, the thing about it though is that maybe it's more like the story of Pandora, the Pandora's box story that Pandora opens the box and all these demons, like death and selfishness and all these different things come out, and then the last thing that comes out is hope. Right, and that's what. So there's something tragic about Kant in the way that he says, look, knowledge of God and most metaphysical truths are, it's not available to us, but we can still hope. It is tragic, but then there's also that sort of,
Right.
it's not totally pessimistic either, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, I can go to 11:30 and then I have to take off. But or 11:20. I think in 10 minutes we could probably at least get through this really important thing and what Schopenhauer has to say. So we've gotten the idea we have this access to the thing in itself in our own bodies.
But I really have to go to the bathroom though.
Oh, you really have to go to the bathroom. All right. Well, we could save it till next week, or I can wait a few minutes or whatever. I don't really care. But
Yeah, let's save it for next week just so I have some time before
we'll do
class.
a couple weeks on Schopenhauer, and let's try not to get sidetracked on lots of other interesting things. Okay, sounds good. I'll see you next week. Bye bye.